Steve Lukather was finished at 18, and Dan Huff was finished by the time he got here. Starting in 1990, I started working all the time, but that was the point where Dan started to lose interest in LA sessions and wanted to, have the band giant. It kind of worked well for me by the time I got my skill level up and my experience up, because I wasn't formed at age 20. All my skills got formed in my late 20s, and I was ready to go at age 30.
You have said, and maybe this is a little bit in jest, but you have said, thank God that Tom Bukovac never moved to LA because he would have taken too much work. And similar to that, I've spoken to Dan Huff, who said that when he moved to LA, there was a real hole in the session scene because Steve Lukather was on tour with Toto. So there was a real hole that he was able to fill. Was one musician really able to have that much of an impact on the scene back then?
I'm so glad you asked, because I experienced that phenomenon, and I was the up-and-coming version of a studio player. I was still collecting my studio skills at that moment when Dan showed up, and I was pretty good at some things, getting better at other things. And then by 1990, I started working every day in the studio because I really got my skill level up. But these other guys were finished already. They got out of, like Steve Lukather was finished at 18, and Dan Huff was finished by the time he got here. So the way I understand it, and I think this is all pretty accurate, Robbie Buchanan, who's a really dear friend of mine, phenomenal keyboard player who I worked with a lot, he experienced Dan's talent in Nashville on a record, and he told Dan, come on out, I'll hook you up. And he did. And so he recommended Dan, and Dan had everything it took to immediately jump in. And you're absolutely right. Lukather was not so interested in session work because they were blowing up and doing amazing, there's a lot of responsibility in being in that band. And then Luke would do the Quincy sessions and a lot of other high profile stuff like that, but he wasn't doing the day-to-day work. So you're right, there was an absence. Now, there is no absence unless the guy who shows up is the most talented guy in the world. And Dan was he was that guy. He could cover everybody's sounds and parts. He could do the R&B thing beautifully. I sat next to him and watched him extrapolate R&B parts that were beautiful and musical and perfect instantly. And then he could do the rock thing. He could, you would hear a thing, you go, oh, that Mike Landau played a great solo. No, it was Dan Huff. So he really was, he was just so hardworking and ambitious and so talented. And he did displace the entire list of guitar players. Now, that didn't mean starting in 1990, I started working all the time, but that was the point where Dan started to lose interest in LA sessions and wanted to, have the band giant. So it actually kind of worked well for me by the time I got my skill level up and my experience up, because I wasn't formed at age 20. All my skills got formed in my late 20s, and I was ready to go at age 30. So I started all that a little later. But when he left, Michael Thompson was the busiest session guitar player. And then that's only because Mike Landau decided to do less. Mike Landau has always been selective. He was selective in the 80s, the 90s. He's always been that guy. And so that left more open slots, but Michael Thompson was the guy at that point, and I was able to become another guy and start working all the time. So,
but the impression of the golden age is that there was just so much work, and it's almost funny that one person, because they can only be one session at a time, would people just say, we'll wait for them, versus calling someone else who was probably amazing also? Like, one person really controlled the scene that way? Or is that sort of a little bit of a fantasy looking back on it?
Well, you're just ahead of home studios for guitar players. So in that era, the keyboard players, a lot of them had their racks at home, and they had 24-track analog machines at home. You remember, we're still in front of Pro Tools. We're still ahead of, this is still analog most of the time. So the digital thing is beginning. When I built my ADAT studio and then my Pro Tools studio, I was able, it was the greatest thing for my work in the history of my work, because I was able to never lose a session because of scheduling. When I built my studio, and I'll come around to your question in a second, but I'm kind of going to the side of it. When I built my studio, I was able to say to people, I can see you on Thursday morning. I can see you Saturday at 11. I can see you Tuesday at 2. Because guitar overdubs, which I ended up specializing at, I liked orchestrating. I liked getting my work done after the bass player and drummer. I enjoyed tracking, but most of the value I could give was in the orchestration of layering guitar parts after all that was done. And that could be done anytime in the process. People were relaxed enough. They would schedule the tracking dates, those were etched in stone. But after that, everything could just unfold as it needed to. So I never lost work after that. After I had my home studio, I never lost a session because of scheduling, because I was literally like a doctor. I can see you at 10 on Thursday, I can see you 2 on Tuesday. So, but prior to that, just prior to that, when guitar players did not have home studios, you are absolutely right. Dan Huff would get the call. If he wasn't available, if he was essential to the work, they might try and move the session so that they could get Jeff Porcaro on drums and Dan Huff on guitar and whoever on bass, Neil Steubenhaus. And if they could find that slot, they would get everybody at the same time. If they couldn't, they would just sacrifice somebody. And then Michael Thompson would be next in line. Michael Lando might be next. I might be fourth in line. I walked into a jingle session once, and it's a really renowned jazz bass player named Dave Carpenter. And the jingle producer was a friend of mine. He said, "Man, I tried 12 different bass players. I couldn't get anybody." And then Dave Carpenter walks in bright and shiny, so happy that he got the session. And I'm sure that happened to me on a daily basis too. But yeah, because of scheduling, that was the reality of it. And also, somebody like Dan, they would get as much of him as they could. So, if you booked Dan Huff for 6 hours, he might be halfway done at the end of hour 6, but he couldn't come back for 2 weeks. So he was out of there. And then I might get the call because they needed more and he was gone, so there was that too.
Right. When you moved to LA, you say that you feel like you had great lead chops, but your rhythm chops needed to develop. How did you sit in on these sessions early on and feel confident or not insecure in your abilities? Or maybe you were insecure. And how did you escape? To me, I get so afraid of going into sessions and not having the right skill set. And it seems like you felt that way too. So how did you get over that when you were starting out?
Well, I never really got over that, but I was quiet, and there's a strength in kind of keeping your mouth shut and just taking everything in. I had a lot of advantages. I kid you not. When I moved to LA in 1980, it was a very nurturing environment for musicians. So, and particularly as a guitar player, I mean, the drummer was always in the hot seat because we were recording analog. The drums had to get nailed, okay? But everybody else, and particularly guitar players, they wanted guitar players to be kind of, and especially when Nirvana showed up and that changing of the guard happened, that's when I really started working it, because I could be the guy who I was reliable enough to get all the parts done, get the sounds done, but I sounded like I could be a band guy. So they wanted guitar players to throw surprises, and you did not have to be perfect as a guitar player. So that's one thing that helped. You did not necessarily have to be the best reader to be a guitar player, and that's another thing that helped. And then I would ask for help. If I was and this happened, if I was in the room with Greg Phil and Gaines, I would go, "Greg, how do I play through that chord? What's that? Show me that passage. What's that line?" I mean, I would just ask for help. So that's one thing. But you're just managing fear at that point. I think a lot of people deal with that all the time. And even some of the guitar players that we know that are, you wouldn't think would feel those insecurities, feel them going into a session. I felt them very severely, especially when I was going in with Nathan East and Greg Phil and Gaines and John Robinson. My stomach would literally be sick, but I would show up there, ask for help, and my part didn't have to be perfect. Their parts were perfect the first time and mine wasn't, but they accepted you. It was okay. So as guitar players, we were forgiven for, playing catch up, and not being the best readers. Now, that being said, you never on a TV film date represent yourself as being a reader when you're not, because those guys, this, you were one of those guys. You show up and you read, and if you read it again, it's only a matter of interpretation, because you get it the first time. The first time it's beautiful, but maybe they want to do this part a little more rubato or whatever. And so that I learned that really, really early. I took a couple of orchestra sessions because I was brave. And it was like sitting there with 90 pieces when you're the guy who doesn't exactly read. It was like, nah, I'll leave this to.
So what would you do? Would you just completely flub those sessions, or how would you get through them?
You get lucky. I got lucky a couple of times, and then I realized I didn't want to just roll those dice anymore.